I'm Rick Smead. I had the honor of kind of initially organizing this thing, and following Bob G did the whole thing last year. And so I had big shoes to fill, and I'm really glad it's working out so well. It's my honor now to introduce our afternoon keynote. Known Michael Weber for quite a while. His bio that you'll have access to says he's a mechanical engineering professor. This is not your father's mechanical engineering professor. Look at the number of things he's done, the degree of his stature internationally as an energy philosopher really is tremendous. I first met him at the Aspen Institute, talking about the big issues way up high in the mountains where you don't have much air and they have plenty of liquor. So I've always been impressed. He has his book, Power Trip, about the history of energy, was reviewed so well by the New York Times and treated so well, it turned into a 6-part PBS series. His bio says that it's been viewed by 1 million people. He found out the other day he dropped a zero there. Now they've added a zero. It's been viewed by 10 million people. So it's a real honor to just get Michael's take on where we're going and what the world looks like. Michael?
Good to see you, Rick. Yeah, I think we met 8 years, 10 years ago. Someone asked me, it went well. As they say in the mountains, the higher you get when you drink. So you got to be careful. So it's good to see you. I think I heard Markham say I'm a fast talker, so you got to get ready to take some notes. I just thought I'd make some remarks, then we'll have some time for questions and corrections and insults or whatever. And I know Allison's here, so she'll probably correct whatever I say that's wrong, but I think I agree with most of it. And Ned will wait to argue with me on Twitter probably later, but we'll figure it out. So anyway, it's good to see you. My name is Michael Weber. I'm here, mechanical engineering at UT, as you heard. I also worked at ENGIE in Paris, France, as our chief science and technology officer. So as a professor, I operate in the world of ideas, but I don't actually have to do anything. In fact, as professors, we say things like, we know it works in practice, but does it work in theory? That's the kind of thing we'll think about. But at ENGIE, in the practical role, you have to do stuff and operate power plants. So I got a little bit of the international practical, get things done, actually operate an energy system perspective. And now I'm back at UT after the 3-year stint in Paris. And I'm also at a venture fund called Energy Impact Partners, which is a $2.5 billion clean tech venture fund. So I'm also on the money side of the table for investment. So I've got different perspectives on energy that will weigh in on this. But in particular, I'm a native to Austin. So I actually live in my childhood home here. I was a faculty brat. My father's a professor here. So I've got a Texas patriot perspective. In fact, I don't know if you see the sort of chimney looking thing out there. So the brick tall thing, that is St. Martin's Lutheran Church. That was my preschool. So I went to preschool right there. It's kind of fun to see that from here. So I've got a long Texas view. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about the freeze from 1.5 years ago, and then kind of where I think Texas is going. And I know we talked about the freeze last time, but the freeze is still relevant in a variety of ways. And as a Texan, I've been through several freezes. So the freeze last year wasn't the first one. And I'll back up and sort of give some context on this, that as we put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and as they accumulate and as they trap radiation and as the atmosphere warms, the warming doesn't happen in a uniform way. In fact, the mid-latitudes do not warm as much as the polar regions. So there's a sort of inequilibrium in how the warming happens. And as the polar regions warm faster than mid-latitudes, it causes a wobbliness in the jet stream. And wobbliness is a scientific term, I believe. So the jet streams moving west to east along the border, say, of Canada and the United States. But as it wobbles, you get these polar vortices as colder air comes further south and warmer air goes further up. So it's not unusual now. It's never really been unusual, but it seems like it's happening with greater frequency and intensity to have cold Arctic air come further south while you're having heat waves on the coast. And those cold fronts can be quite impactful. The 2014 polar vortex caught a lot of news, in 2020 as well. So let me tell you the sequence of how this works. As a polar vortex comes down, we can see it in Texas coming down through the Dakotas or whatever, the Great Plains states, and we get a couple days warning that there's cold air on the way. And as the cold air hits Texas, the demand for energy goes up in 2 ways, especially for home heating. We're 60% electric home heating in Texas and 40% natural gas heating with maybe a couple % propane. the electric home heating is almost exclusively electric resistance heating, but a little bit like heat pumps, which are a little more efficient. And so the demand for electricity goes up and the demand for gas goes up for home heating at the same time that we start to have freeze-offs of the gas system, where the gas system cannot produce as much gas as it used to, because when you produce gas, it comes with other liquids that can freeze, or the pumps or other equipment will freeze, and then you can't get the supply to where you need it. But by law, it has to go to homes. And so we start to have low pressure or less supply available to power plants. And then at the same time, the reason electric heat, half the power sector in Texas is fueled by gas. So gas is important directly for home heating, but also indirectly for power generation from home heating. So the demand for gas is like a double whammy up. At the same time that production can sag because of freeze-offs, or pressures can sag because demand will exceed the supply and this kind of thing. So this happens. And then as the fuel supplies get cut off to the power plants turn off power, they often will turn off power to the gas system, which makes the gas supply system worse, which makes you turn off more power plants, and then you have all sorts of disasters. Everything I just told you was the exact sequence for the 2011 freeze. Same stuff, same kind of complaints, same kind of sequence, same kind of concerns. Big studies, lots of gnashing of teeth and stomping of feet, and people saying we can't let this happen again. And the reports was probably we should winterize and weatherize the power sector, probably we should winterize and weatherize the gas system, probably the gas system should talk to the power system so they know where each other are, so they don't cut each other off. And that was the official report, came out 6 months after the freeze in August of 2011. The legislature was in session just like it was this time. We called that one the Groundhog Day freeze because it's February 1st or 2nd or whatever Groundhog Day is, as opposed to the Valentine's Day freeze of 2021. And a lot of great analysis that really went nowhere for the most part. And the legislature, interestingly, basically ignored it in 2011. Didn't touch the issue. I think they had to fight about who gets to use what bathrooms or something. I can't remember what they fought about in 2011, but apparently energy reliability wasn't that big a concern in 2011. However, some individual decision makers took it seriously. Some large fleet owners like NRG and Vistra weatherized, El Paso weatherized, UT weatherized, Austin Energy weatherized. So some people in the power sector took sort of the investments to make the system more robust, but not everyone in the power sector. And then between 2011 and 2021, a couple other things happened. One is wind continued to boom, just built a lot of wind. We started to build a lot of solar as well. Storage wasn't as big a story by 2021, but it has been a story in the last year and a half. But also the shale revolution took off in a variety of ways. Now, shale revolution really started, say, 2007, 2008, mostly in the Barnett up near Dallas, Fort Worth. Also in the Haynesville, those areas didn't freeze as badly as West Texas, but by 2012 and 14 is when the Permian Basin took off for shale. So a lot of the shale growth after the 2011 freeze was in West Texas, where it was particularly cold and liquids rich, and it had the freeze-offs in 2021. And the Permian Basin, I think, is the single most electrified oil and gas field in the world, or one of the most electrified, if not the most electrified. In fact, deregulation of ERCOT in the late 90s, which led to the ability to have lower prices for industrial contracts, is one of the reasons why we had a shale boom in Texas, because we had cheaper access to electricity you need for shale oil and gas production. We don't think about it. We think of like deregulation of ERCOT as good for the individual consumers, but it was really good for the oil and gas industry as well, because they could come in and get like 6-cent contracts or something, whereas they would have been paying 10 cents before. So deregulation really enabled the shale boom, which happened after the 2011 freeze. Wind growth continues after 2011. Then you have solar growth plus population growth. I mean, I don't know how many millions of people we added to Texas, but all with the same natural gas infrastructure system, except for more wellheads for the most part. So then 2021 happened, same kind of freeze, but it's colder for longer. It's more widespread than 2011. It's in 2021. It's every county is under a freeze watch at the exact same moment, which is relatively unique, I think, at least in modern recorded history. And so it was just a more devastating thing, but now we've got more gas production, but more of it froze off, especially in the West, where it's so liquids rich and was very cold. The Permian Basin production for gas dropped like 85%, statewide 50%. The Eastern resources like Haynesville did okay. And Jerry Jones went on TV and said, I made billions of dollars with Comstock on the East, and people were trying to like, try not to brag about all the money you made while people died. So that was awkward, but the fields had different kind of performances. Going through the sequence, gas started to freeze February 10th. The power system really failed February 15th, say, early in the morning. And this timing is important because the way I think of it is like the energy system is a delicate floral pattern of dominoes that are so pretty. But at the end of it, all the dominoes have been knocked down, and any one domino knocks the others down. And I basically say all the dominoes fell down, but the biggest domino to fall and the first domino to fall was gas. But wind failed, solar failed, coal failed, nuclear failed, other parts of the system failed, transmission systems failed, feeders failed. Everybody failed with the exception of hydro. Hydro is the only sort of resource that performed higher than normal during the storm. It went from 200 megawatts to 400 megawatts, which is basically nothing, but still it was twice nothing. So that was good. It went higher than normal, but only for like a day and a half or something in there. But I thought that was interesting. And though I say everybody failed and underperformed, the solar people are kind of sensitive and will say, actually, solar overperformed compared to the extreme weather scenarios, which is true. So solar underperformed compared to, say, normal weather, but overperformed compared to extreme weather. Maybe solar overperformed, but for the most part, it's just easier to think of as everybody failed. But some people fail worse than others. And the gas power interconnection is really important because our power system is so dependent on gas. Half our power comes from gas. We rely on gas. We especially rely on gas if wind and solar are going to fail. And wind and solar failed, and then nuclear and coal failed. Everybody failed. So we need gas more than ever, but gas failed. So then you get hundreds of deaths. You get all these damages and all these kind of things. So this is a big consequence. Happened during the legislative session again. This time, to its credit, the legislature took some action. I think we need to applaud the legislature for saying, okay, we're not going to ignore it this time, but we're going to look at half the problem. We're going to look at the power sector, not the gas sector. And I would say as an engineer, probably you should look at both. Anyway, they looked at the power sector, lots of scrutiny, weatherization, changing the price cap, all this kind of stuff. So a lot of attention on the power sector, and we can hem and haw about whether that worked. But for the most part, the power sector kind of is doing better today. We built some more stuff, and it seems like we have more response signals and that kind of thing. Gas basically got a pass, and the Railroad Commission was tasked with, well, come up with something someday in the future on this, which they just released not that long ago. Now for our second winter later, that maybe gas will have to winterize and do a couple of things. It looks pretty flimsy in my opinion. However, there's one very important feature of this, which is the gas industry needs to alert the power industry to where it is. If you look back in February 2021, only a couple hundred gas sites, which could be compressor stations or wellheads or whatever it is, had informed their power providers that they exist, and that it would be nice if they wouldn't lose their power during a crisis, because they're critical to make the gas available for the power sector. A few hundred had done that. After all this scrutiny, we now have, I can't remember, 9,000 to over 10,000. We now have many, many thousands of gas sites that are registered as critical infrastructure. So we went from a problem of having too few properly registered, now too many, frankly. Because if everybody's critical, you can't turn power off on anybody. So this is kind of an interesting problem, but good news that we have a better map of where the gas industry is. And I would say, I don't think the gas industry will be under a lot of pressure to winterize in Texas, but at least we can know where the gas devices are so we don't make the problem worse. So maybe, I think we're overall in better condition now than we were a year and a half ago, but I would say we're pretty far from perfect. As long as we're codependent, if you have one part is robust and the other part's not, then the vulnerabilities remain. Backing up on that, so I'll pick on gas a little bit more just because I think the story, well, maybe I'll pick on everybody. So wind failed in a variety of ways. Wind failed because the gearing froze up or ice formed on the blades. And either way, it's damaging. Such a problem. Sometimes the wind farms were behind a substation that froze up. So that was basically the same thing. I mean, what's the point of having a working wind farm if the wires and poles aren't going to work? So that was a major failure for wind. Wind developers can do the cold weather equipment packages. And I can't remember what they cost, like $20,000 or $50,000 when you install, but they're pretty expensive to retrofit. And they're bad for summer performance. So most wind developers in Texas don't do the cold weather packages, even though you can do them. We do them in the North Sea and other places, just because it costs money and it degrades performance when it's hot out. And that's when you're worried about having wind generate the most, is when it's hot out, not when it's cold. So maybe wind made some bad decisions about where they're located or how they're located or what they do with their winter packages or what they do with de-icing, and new blades have de-icers and this kind of thing. Solar failed in a variety of ways. A lot of the solar was covered in snow. I have rooftop solar panels that were completely covered in snow. That wasn't very helpful in the middle of it. The industrial ones actually can shake or turn away from the snow so they don't get covered. So they're not available while it's snowing, but they'll be available immediately afterwards, or the snow melts pretty quickly. The way the equipment is, it's actually a little warmer, so the snow won't accumulate for too long. So that was a problem for solar. It certainly wasn't generating when it was nighttime, which is when it was really worse, say at 2 a.m. on February 15th. Coal failed mostly from frozen coal piles, but also some frozen water circulation systems. That was an issue. A lot of pipes were exposed. In Texas, we build our power plants exposed to get rid of the heat. If you go to Vermont, they build the same power plant, but put a building around it to keep it kind of cozy in the winter. We don't do that. But there are things you can do with windbreaks and temporary enclosures, things like that, that maybe a lot of coal hadn't done. Nuclear, which normally does fine. We had one of our 4 power plants down because of a feed water pump or something that froze. That was a big deal. So everybody failed. Gas power plants failed in 2 ways. Either the gas power plant itself wasn't winterized. There are some that fail every time it's cold, and I think this is probably an issue we're dealing with. But also many failed because they couldn't get the fuel supply. And there are a variety of reasons for that. One is the fuel supply might have been cut off. It might have been the power customer ordered a non-firm version of the fuel. In some cases, firm supplies were cut off too, which so even a firm contract didn't always help you. Or even if you had fuel, the pressure might be too low. Some of these new gas turbine systems require higher pressures. And if you don't have an on-site compressor, if the pressure goes too low, you can't run your power plant. So there's all sorts of problems. I'm basically just quoting Rick Smead's article he put out like 2 weeks after this whole thing happened. So the power sector has a lot of sins, and then the gas sector has 4 main sins, I would say. And the first sin is it didn't winterize, even though the gas system can work great in cold weather. It works in Canada, works in Nebraska. Like we know that the gas system can work in cold weather. We just don't really winterize it in Texas. So maybe that's sin number 1. Sin number 2 is not to sign up as critical infrastructure, except for those few hundred who did. And that's like a 2-page form. That was easy. They should have done that. Maybe we can have some grace on that because most of the gas production that was failing was new after the 2011 storm, as I mentioned. So yeah, it was a new procedure. We have some new gas guys. So maybe that wasn't obvious. A lot of the gas industry, so this is like sin number 3, signed up for interruptible power. If you want to be a power plant and you want to be reliable, probably need firm gas. If you want to be a gas producer and you're electric, you probably need firm power. But they signed up for interruptible power to get the cheaper contracts, which is fine. You just can't claim to be a firm source of energy if you're signing up for interruptible power. And then this is the worst. Many of them signed up for the ERS program, which is they were paid to shut off in the depth of the crisis. And I think that's actually pretty spectacularly bad. So this is just a crisis overall. Everyone, a lot of failure to go around, a lot of blame, a lot of things have improved, but we're not all the way there. The thing that alarms me the most is that when wind underperformed, they left money on the table. When solar underperformed, they left money on the table. When coal underperformed, they left money on the table. When nuclear underperformed, left money on the table. When gas underperformed, it made a ton of money. So there's a huge market incentive problem where there's reward for flimsiness, essentially, because as gas supply goes down by 50%, prices go up by 100. And so why should I weatherize? It's actually quite profitable to have a constraint in the system. That's a massive problem that can be fixed with better market signals or regulation or something, but has not been fixed to my knowledge. And that's, I think, unique to Texas interstate gas market. That is not a phenomenon that happens many other places in the world, I would say. So that's where we are. Despite how negative that sounds, we're actually in a pretty good situation because what Texas can do better than anyone is build a lot of stuff. So built some gas, we built some wind, built some solar, built some storage. Importantly, we have more demand response tools, I think, today than before. That is the biggest opportunity. We just released a report from my group. I haven't really been public about it, but just a few weeks ago, there's at least 5 gigawatts, but probably as much as 8 to 12 gigawatts of demand response available in Texas. And it's a whole lot cheaper to do demand response than to build new supply. Demand response is like $250 a kilowatt, as opposed to, I don't know, $1,000 a kilowatt. If we could just turn off or cycle things with great fidelity, pool pumps, heaters, washers, dryers, furnaces, air conditioners, you name it, we can save a lot of money and improve resilience and get better capital utilization of the overall fleet. I think that would drive down costs for everybody. So demand response is the missing thing. We have smart meters and we have all these things that we could do. Maybe we could do it in a fine way, but you don't need that. In France, they using analog 1970s technology with an electric heating system for electric water heaters. They send a little analog pulse down the wires that flips a switch of water heaters and turns off multiple gigawatts of electric demand in a moment's notice. And they do that around 10 p.m. and they turn it back on like at 6 a.m. So they do demand response and have been doing that for decades in France using 1970s technology. And no one really cares if their electric water heaters off at 2 a.m. And if you really care, you can go override and flip the switch back. So we could do this, and just water heating alone in Texas is a couple gigawatts. So there's an opportunity there that I think we should pursue. And that's a part of the conversation. I know a lot of you are in these conversations with the PUC and with ERCOT about how to remake the rules. So that's where we are. Add into that recovering and licking our wounds from February 2021 and what's going to happen next are all these changes happening in the world of energy at the same time. The changes are demographic around population growth and economic growth and urbanization, electrification, and motorization, industrialization, all these things happening around the world, driving up demand. At the same time, we have trends towards efficiency and information intensity and robustness and decentralized generation. So the whole world of energy is changing. And now we've got to push for decarbonization as well. So there's a changing fuel mix that's going to happen. And this makes Texans nervous because when we do the math, and we're pretty bad at math, I would say in Texas, but we do the math, it's like, oh, we have more wind. Now the grid failed. Must be because of wind. Like correlation is not the same as causation, but that's the way we think about it. So people get nervous that if we have more of whatever it is, decarbonized sources, it's going to make the whole system less reliable. And it can make it less reliable if you do it in a bad way, but it will hopefully not all be wind and solar. Hopefully it'll be some more nuclear and some geothermal, some gas with carbon capture or hydrogen or something like that. But it's all changing. And this makes Texas nervous because we got rich in an era where we didn't care about carbon. And the question is, well, what happens in an era where we do care about carbon? We released a big study in April this year. My group is a 2.5-year study, quite robust analysis of getting Texas to net zero by 2050. And net zero is important. We don't say getting Texas to zero, getting Texas to net zero. Net zero, I mean, you might still have emissions in Houston, but you take emissions out of the air, say, I don't know, in West Texas or somewhere. On net, it's zero, but you still have some emissions in places here or there. And we looked at a couple scenarios to get Texas to net zero with prioritizing hydrogen or carbon capture or electrification. They're all more economically robust than doing nothing, which is fascinating because of the damages you avoid and the health effects you improve because of asthma and air pollution, this kind of thing, which is sort of fascinating. They all create jobs. They all save water, although the hydrogen scenarios are less beneficial from a water perspective because you would use so much water to make the hydrogen. They all keep gas in the mix. In a net zero world, if you want to get there as cheaply, as quickly, and as equitably as possible, gas is part of the mix. We did an all electric scenario where you could not have natural gas in the mix, and that ended up being a little more expensive. Keeping gas in the mix is a faster, cheaper way to zero than not. And then adding direct air capture, some way to scrub out the carbon. And this is important. Coal's a loser any way you slice it. Coal does not stay in the mix. It doesn't look competitive. So coal loses. Gas hangs in there. Nuclear does fine. Geothermal kind of limps along because it still looks expensive. Wind and solar storage are some of the big winners. But we find that we can get net zero in Texas and make a lot of money because we still have a lot of the resources that we could export elsewhere or just use for ourselves. So, so I think this is important. I try to go on time. I'm like, yeah, and I think net zero is actually pretty good for Texas. Like, not only good for people who breathe in Texas, but it's good for our energy economy because those things I mentioned, hydrogen, carbon capture, and gas and geothermal, leverage the oil and gas industry's expertise and skill sets and capacity and assets. And if you think about offshore, well, who does offshore better than anyone in the world? That's oil and gas. It really is bad for coal mining dependent economies like West Virginia, Illinois, and Wyoming. And Wyoming knows this. That's why they're trying to double down right now on nuclear, which is fascinating, and wind. Like they kind of see this. So they've done the same analysis. So I think those are things to think about as we're still limping along from February 2021, but actually I'm pretty optimistic that we're further along. I think the vulnerabilities remain with the gas sector. I don't think there's any regulatory pressure to fix it really. I think that there's a lot of growth happening in energy, especially on the power side, but hydrogen and carbon management as well. And they're going to leverage what we do in Texas. We're going to get rich. ExxonMobil just announced, I think, the world's largest hydrogen plant in Baytown, for example, using steam methane reforming, taking methane, making hydrogen, but with carbon capture. And half of it will be for their own use for industrial heat and for chemicals. And the other half will put into trunk lines to sell to people for, say, long haul transportation. There's certain types of transportation that are hard to electrify, like trucking and marine and aviation, and hydrogen will be critical for that. So that's kind of my optimistic view. And I think I'm at time. So I'll stop there. Maybe we have time for one question or an insult or whatever. We'll take it. But this is kind of my view on what happened a year and a half ago and where I think we're headed in Texas. And I appreciate your attention and time. So thank you for that. And Rick, do we have time or no? You're kind of the boss. Okay. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
Upstream, midstream, downstream. I think some of our electric partners are suffering from some of the same rhetoric where everybody's being lumped in with their level of performance during the storm. No, that's to Todd and Texoga, that they are in a very different position than we are.
I mean, to like freeze offs at the wellhead versus along the pipes and that kind of thing. Yeah, I think that's true. And yeah, this is a fair point. And not all pipelines are the same as well. And there's interstate and interstate. Some pipes, most pipes did fine, some didn't. But most of the problems were at the well, or maybe the gathering systems, or some of the water separation systems. That's a fair point. You can move it.
All of our intrastate, I can't speak to interstate, but everybody.
Yeah, fair point. The although there were firm contracts that were cut off, right? That.
My knowledge, there haven't been any transport. I can't speak to their supply.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Good point. Yeah, the complex industry, say the gas industry, is unfairly broad. I think that's a good point. Great, thank you for that correction. Any other corrections? Yeah.
Actually, I had a question. I always wondered who the guy was in a producer who His boss suddenly found out they could get $200 an MCF for their gas, ran in and said, we're going to be rich. And the guy said, I'm sorry, boss, we're all shut in. I figured that would be a bad thing, but then found out how much of the gas production in Texas is hedged. So it was really Bank Paribas that was making money or somebody, you know, it wasn't, and the economic incentive wasn't direct for the producers in the way that you'd hope it would be to be online.
Some producers printed money like Continental and
Yeah.
And Comstock. I mean, they were like very open, like their
Yeah.
products. So we know what the numbers were. They made a lot of money. Sometimes it was their investors or someone else in Wall Street or elsewhere. Yeah. So it wasn't always the producer who made the money because they've already sold it forward on some of the
Yeah.
contractors. I think that's right.
Yeah.
The other thing you made a point there, like there are a lot of people who would have liked to have sold, but were shut in or frozen in or whatever it was for a safety reason or equipment failure. And this is a strong market signal to winterize so that next time there's a price spike, you could sell.
You would
But
hope.
we had the exact same signals in 2011 and that didn't work for 2021. So normally I would believe that would sort of cajole people into action. I'm not sure that worked. Now, probably more for the pipelines and storage companies than for the
Mhm.
wellheads themselves.
Yeah, and that was the really the issue, that if they weren't the ones making the money, if they managed to produce, then they didn't care as much as they would have otherwise, was the concern. Thanks.
It also depends on whether your operations are all in one field or if you have like one field might be damaged or other area. Might be.
Okay, well, I think that's about it for time.
Thank you.
So, please join me.